My name is Owen Smith, and I'm happy to welcome everybody here. Looks like a great crowd. I'm very fortunate that I walked around this room, and I think I know everybody in this room, or virtually everybody in this room, so I'm not going to get involved in talking about who I am. We're here for an event that Bernadette has talked to me about doing for at least 6 months or a year. Those of you who haven't figured it out yet, today would have been Bill Casey's 100th birthday. Hence the timing, and I'm very happy that the staff at the Institute of World Politics has helped by putting together this event, and I've said it a couple times yesterday, I say it again, thank you, thank you, thank you to all the IWP staffers who have worked on this event. You've done a wonderful job. There is a priest who our family has known for more years, I think, that he and I either of us wanted to acknowledge, who is currently working in the Holy Land, and he's going to lead us in a prayer to start. Father Emmett Kelly.
The nature of the prayer is going to require me just to say a couple of lines to complete Owen's introduction at the request of John, the director of IWP. I was born in the Holy Land, like you might figure out, right? And I work in the Promised Land in Jerusalem. So that was a providential preparation. And I run a little tent of Abraham in the desert. It's a house with 280 beds. It's the Vatican guest house in Jerusalem for pilgrims and visitors to Jerusalem. And we are blessed there to receive everybody. We have about 30% Protestant coming to the house, and we have Armenians and Greek Orthodox and Jews on Shabbat, and we even have some Muslims show up on certain occasions for, these type of NGO meetings with peace at the grassroots level and so on. And then our director calls it Noah's Ark. All God's creatures fit in there. So we decided to do a similar project in Galilee, 2.5 hours north on the Sea of Galilee. And we could have ended up anywhere in a beautiful hill with a beautiful view of the lake, but we ended up in Magdala. You probably heard of the name Magdala, associated with Mary Magdalene. And there, in the process of building this new center, we were blessed with a huge discovery. We found and excavated a first-century synagogue. It's the 7th first-century synagogue ever excavated, and there are pieces of mosaic and frescoes from the 1st century, making it the most beautiful synagogue of antiquity. And it happens also to be the first synagogue ever excavated where Jesus walked from his time. So it's an amazing experience of going back in history and touching those places at that time. It brings everybody together. And there also inside the synagogue we found a carved stone the size of a coffee table that's completely unique. Never was anything found like it, carved on all sides with religious symbolism pertaining to the Temple of Jerusalem. And on this stone there's the oldest menorah ever found on stone. And obviously interest in archaeology grew, and one thought fascinates me about archaeology. You see the archaeologists, the volunteers, we've over had 550 volunteers from 20 countries, and you see them finding a piece of mosaic, a little bit of fresco, and getting so excited about finding this remnant from 1,500 years ago. And then I was thinking, what about the Byzantine people who built it, or the 1st century Jews who built that synagogue? And say, is that all you're finding from my beautiful synagogue? Is that all you're finding from my beautiful building from our empire? It's a different perspective. So on that way, I want to say these couple of words of prayer. Archaeology shows us how civilizations pass away. We are so thrilled to find a little piece of mosaic, remains of splendid buildings of ancient empires. Life is changed, not taken away. All the battles Bill fought, all the intelligence he sought, like St. Thomas Aquinas commented, on his deathbed about his massive theological work and requested it be burned as a piece of useless straw. These quests of Bill now seem to him so deeply relativized as he contemplates the divinity without the earthly veil. We thank God for his life, which emerged 100 years ago to daylight. His long, faithful marriage to Sophia, and his most magnificent legacy, Bernadette. We ask you to bless all these states, men and women, and those preparing for statecraft who are here today to serve their country and peoples far beyond these borders, to know in depth the dignity of every human person and serve their well-being with their whole heart and soul. Bless all those gathered here today to learn dedication and courage, wisdom and humility, as each of us explores Bill Casey's accomplishments and discern the duties we are called to nobly fulfill in our brief time on this earth. God bless America. God bless mankind across the entire globe. Amen.
Thank you, Father. Those are words of wisdom. Thank you for joining us. I know this was the last minute, and because I know you're supposed to be in Rome voting, but not quite yet. By the way, I heard black smoke this morning, so we don't have any news. As you know, this event is being sponsored by the Institute for World Politics, a graduate school, which is essentially a graduate school which is trying to train young men and women to go forward in the world and to ensure that we don't have any more WW1s and WW2s and the like. I like to think of it, you know, we're trying to prevent another Cold War. We're trying to build peace. And it was John Lenczowski's notion to set up the school quite a few years ago. And he is now the chairman. Half the people in this room, of course, know the school as John's place, but technically it's the Institute of World Politics. So I'm going to ask John Lenczowski, who had a long experience with Bill during the Reagan administration at the National Security. He's been in education for many years at Georgetown, and he's been running IWP for how many years now? 22 years. So I haven't been chairman that long. So John is going to welcome you on behalf of the Institute.
Thank you, Owen. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great pleasure and an honor to have you all here. This is a very special event for us at IWP, and I wanted to thank Owen and Bernadette for their extraordinary leadership in putting this together. We've been particularly blessed at the Institute to have an association with the Casey Smith family, and we also have been the beneficiaries of an extraordinary donation, which is that part of Bill Casey's personal library, which concerns international relations, war, intelligence, and the like. I had the privilege of being received by Sophia in the family home at Maynole a number of years ago, and I saw this library, and it was an object of great envy to witness this extraordinary collection, and we maintain it as just a half a block away on our campus as a portrait of Bill Casey's mind and as a standard to which our students can to which our students can try to meet so that they understand what kind of intellectual parameters and depth has to be achieved in order to reach the summit of the intelligence business. For those of you who don't know IWP, we are a school of statecraft, international affairs, and national security. We're the only school in the country that is specifically designed to have a curriculum architecture to study all of the different arts of statecraft, including military strategy, intelligence, counterintelligence, the arts of diplomacy and peacemaking, public diplomacy, cultural diplomacy, and those harder-edged elements of strategic influence, including strategic communications, counterpropaganda, political action, political warfare, ideological warfare. We also cover various aspects of economic strategy and how all of these arts are integrated into, so to speak, the symphony of our national strategy. We liken each of them to an instrument in an orchestra, and we want our students to be able to play their instrument well, but as I like to say, you cannot be blaring your trumpet loudly when it's the time of the symphony to listen to the harp. And the conductors have to be aware that there even is a harp in the orchestra, not to mention the woodwinds and the double basses. And so integrated strategic thinking is a large part of our philosophy, and we're particularly interested that people master the non-military instruments of statecraft so that we can minimize the necessity of having to use force and spill blood and treasure unnecessarily, unless it's finally a last resort. We have been particularly inspired by Bill Casey at IWP. I had the great privilege myself when I worked in the National Security Council of having numerous interactions with him and with his extraordinary staff. I got personally interested in the subject of intelligence policy and had to learn, unfortunately, through a lot of on-the-job training about how I, in a policy-making position, had responsibilities in intelligence policy, and how I also could be a better consumer of intelligence. And I found that many policymakers are not as good consumers of intelligence as they ought to be, precisely because they don't know the process and they are under illusions about how the intelligence system works. And so we started teaching intelligence at IWP from our very first year of offering classes in 1992, and it's been an integral part of our curriculum ever since. We have been constantly inspired by the legacy of Bill on so many different aspects of this study, and I may get a chance to say a few more words about this later. But I just wanted to say it is a great honor to see so many distinguished public servants here, people who had worked with Bill. I know that there are one or two former directors of Central Intelligence in our number, people who have worked anonymously, who have been the generals of the intelligence community, and I just want to thank you for being here and your participation. Thank you. I forgot. It's now my my pleasure to do my duty to introduce Bernadette Casey Smith, Bill's daughter, who has done so much to help maintain Bill's legacy, and she is a font of information about so many different aspects of Bill's life, having traveled with him around the world a number of times and been intimately involved in so many of the different aspects of his professional career, not to mention being his baby daughter. Bernadette, please come up and welcome everybody.
Oh, thank you so much. Happy birthday, Dad. It's so wonderful to see so many of Dad's old friends here. It's unbelievable. A passing thought, a whim, I said, oh, gee, wouldn't it be nice, has become a reality. And I am just so thankful for all of you for being here. And Owen, I want to thank you, my love, for putting this together. I thought of it, but he ran with it, and here we are. And the Institute, John, and your colleagues, and especially Amanda and Rachel, you did an incredible job. The booklet on Dad is extraordinary. I will treasure it always. And I don't see it, but Barbara Haywood, who helped gather all the Reaganites and all Dad's friends from many facets of his life, worked tirelessly to put this together. She was Dad's secretary in New York before the campaign, the primary, and came to Washington, stayed in Washington, became George Bush's secretary in the White House as vice president, and it's been just so wonderful. Thank you for putting this wonderful day together, Barbara, wherever you are. And again, for all of you for sharing this day with us. I know Dad would be very pleased to see all his friends and colleagues and associates here, and admirers too, people who weren't even born when Dad was in government. I'm often asked, what was Bill Casey like? And my answer is the best. What else would you expect an only daughter to say? But it's true. It's true. He was supportive, funny, adventurous, whimsical, and caring. He loved to read. He loved to play golf, as you all know, and always took a telephone call. Anyone who called, he would answer the phone, which is very unusual in Washington. He was a very hard worker, but he always had time for others. He could be on his dining room table writing a very important speech or a paper, and you would say, "Hey, Dad, you want to go to the movies?" Up he went in, and he was ready to go. He was fun to be around. Owen and I used to double date with them because they were our most interesting friends. And you know what? He thought I was great. Even when I was a gawky kid, he thought I was great. It was wonderful. He always included me in everything he did, whether it was dinner at the White House or a trip around the world. He wanted me to experience the wonders he experienced. And that's a treasure that I'll always have. Either with friends, dinner with friends, or traveling. We saw the world together. In politics and before, when I graduated from high school, he decided that I had to see the world, so I had a grand tour. We spent 11 weeks in Europe. It was unbelievable. And he knew everything. He knew, what he was seeing, the history. It was exhausting, but it was wonderful. And the only thing he said, I don't know if you're getting everything. What church is this? What church is that? We saw 4 cathedrals a day. I mean, it was a little hard at 18 to remember them all, but it was such a great experience. And with Dad's friends, I met people all around the world and of great position, and it wasn't their position. There's just some wonderful, wonderful people in government. And I had the privilege of meeting them, which I'm very thankful for. Getting back to Dad. Dad's core positions were rock solid. He very simply loved his God, his country, and his family. And the best way I can kind of portray that to you is that I want to share with you a letter that he wrote me on my first birthday, which I didn't know existed until Dad passed. And People magazine came over and said, "Hey, don't you have any young pictures of your father?" And we were in a picture family. We never really took pictures. So I said, well, I remembered in the top of Mom's closet, there was this big box with a lot of letters that Dad wrote her through the years. And I said, maybe there's a picture in there. So I went up, I got the box, I took out the first letter, and it was to me. And this is what I read. It was written on May 10th, 1944. My darling daughter, I'm going to take a sip. Excuse me. I'm getting dry. That's good. Today is your first birthday. Though there is an ocean between us, I feel that you and I, through your mother, are as close today in spirit and soul as I know your mother and I are. There is no material thing that I would not give to bring the three of us together quickly and forever. You don't remember, but we'll never forget the quiet happiness and joy we knew when you were just a little bundle of joy of 2, 3, 4, 5 months. I used to come home and wrestle all around the house with you. You squawked and squirmed and grunted and groaned, just like a wrestler should. Then we'd eat, and you'd insist on your mother holding you in one arm and trying to eat with the other. Somehow she always managed. Then we'd roll you out to the roof deck to give you some fresh air and to give the neighbors a chance to admire you. You'd delight all of us by smiling and looking very happy and content. As I write now, I have a picture of you standing with the help of a big tree, but still standing. Your mother sent it to me, and it must have been taken when you were about 11 months old. Looking down at me from the mantelpiece is a picture of you, your mother and me, just before I went overseas. It's hard for me to realize that you've become such a big girl in the 6 months between those two pictures, and it will always be a big loss to me not to have seen and helped you grow. But we'll make up for it when we start over again. I remember so vividly the night there were two. We had the picture of the three of us taken the Sunday I left you in Belmore, and the morning I left your mom in Washington. I was filled with such a strong mixture of zest for the pending adventure and a strong desire to do my part in the nasty job which faced my generation, and sadness and apprehension at leaving those I loved dearly. Now it seems like a bad dream to which I'd like to return because you and your mother were there. Today, things seem brighter. This ocean was placed between us by forces you never knew, which the generation before mine failed to control and which mine must stamp out. It is and will be more of a nasty job, but it is a task which must be done if we are to live in peace, freedom, and decency. We shrank from the job, and the dangers grew. And then we found the will to tackle it. And now it seems certain that the job will be done, and that my generation and yours will get a chance to control the forces of aggression and brutality with God's blessing, to have fun together in our penthouse in New York, on the farm your mom wants, in the suburb home with a lot of glass and lots of rolling ground, with all the books we'll get to and read, with all the friends we'll have, with trips to Europe and Ireland and South America and California, and the West Indies, where your mom and I had our honeymoon. And talking and swapping ideas, and then just being kind to each other and everybody else, and in worship of God and in living the way He intended us to live. Next time you write, don't tell me you have more hair than I have, or you'll be over my knee and your dignity will be invaded as soon as I cross the ocean again. All my love, your dad. My mom and Dad were an amazing team, and I truly believe Dad would not have accomplished as much as he did had he not have a partner like my mother to support him. They were just wonderful together, and she was an amazing woman in her own right. But that's another birthday party, so. Dad was committed to making the world a safe place for freedom-loving people. He spent his life focusing on peace and security, starting as a young man during World War II, up to bringing down the Soviet Union at the CIA. Unfortunately, today, our generation and your generation have a similar fight. Different enemies, but a similar fight. And I just want to say, thankfully, today we have the Institute of World Politics and John Lenczowski, who has taken up the cause that were so important to Dad in a different way, but just as passionately. John is defending our way of life and our freedom by teaching the important art of national security, international affairs, and statecraft to the next generation. Bravo, John. Keep up your phenomenal job. And if there's anyone here who loves their country and wants to see it remain strong and free, the Institute of World Politics is what you should support. I thank you, and I know today is going to be wonderful. Thank you all for coming.
I think one of the eras of Bill Casey's professional career that he was most proud of and that he liked to look back on was his role during the Second World War. Unfortunately, we didn't have copies. We do have copies of his book on the American Revolution, which you'll be receiving at lunchtime, I guess. They're outside in the lobby for anybody who'd like one. But he also wrote a book during the, just before he became DCI, and he didn't publish it while he was DCI because he felt it wouldn't be appropriate to publish it. But he had promised one of his mentors, Wild Bill Donovan, that he would do a book on the OSS, and he did. And many of you have probably seen it. It's available. If you contact me, I can make sure you get a copy. He really enjoyed his involvement with the OSS. He was one of the people who helped put together the Veterans of the OSS, which is now the OSS Society. And I've asked a friend of his, pardon me, a person who we worked with in the OSS, who is the only OSS officer who continues at the CIA. He's still active at the CIA, or he's currently active at the CIA. He's had a couple other careers as a professor at Harvard, in the State Department for a lot of years, in the intelligence side of the State Department. Since then, he's been the deputy ambassador. He was a part of the staff with Dick Walters, General Vernon Walters. I shouldn't be so informal, but everybody who knew him, Walters told a story. He says, anybody that calls me, hey, Vern, obviously doesn't know me. Everybody knew him as Dick. But he was at the UN and in Germany with General Walters and as an ambassador. And he is now the fancy title, I never remember your title, Special Assistant for Foreign Intelligence Relationships at the CIA. And I'm going to ask him to talk a little bit about the OSS and Bill's role at the OSS. We're going to sit down for this one. So, Hugh Montgomery. I didn't say his name. That's terrible. Hugh Montgomery. I know him as Hugh. I'm supposed to call him Mr. Ambassador, but I know him as Hugh. Okay.
Sure.
Huh? You sure?
Yep.
Okay. I'm allowed to call you Hugh?
You may call me whatever you choose. Very good. Is it extra charge for the third degree, or?
Does that make it hard for you?
No, heavens no.
Probably turn it off.
No, heavens no. Down? Okay. Audible?
Yes.
That may not necessarily be good, but I'll let you decide. It's really a very special privilege for me and honor to participate in this celebration of the remarkable life and accomplishments of William J. Casey, a talented patriot whom I had the pleasure and challenge of serving within two very important periods in our respective lives. It's particularly fitting that any commemoration of this rewarding career should pay particular attention to his relatively brief but enormously formative time with the Office of Strategic Services under the leadership of another gifted and charismatic leader, Bill Donovan, General William J. Donovan. Their lives were closely linked in a fateful war which deeply affected both men and established a bond which was severed only by the death of General Donovan. Is that? A little closer to you. Okay. It's threatening me. Okay. Audible. In the back? Heads are nodding, maybe not. It is for this reason that some understanding of how the Office of Strategic Services came into being and how General Donovan came to lead it so gloriously is essential to understanding its impact on the life and achievements of his distinguished namesake. As the clouds of war gathered over Europe, President Roosevelt early on recognized that the information he was getting from other governmental institutions, especially the State Department, pause, and then the War Department was vague, poorly written, and often contradictory, leading him to fall back upon trusted friends and acquaintances to act as his eyes and ears to provide him with accurate and timely, well-informed insights into what was really taking place across the oceans. His Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, urged FDR to enlist the services of a fellow New Yorker and successful lawyer, William J. Donovan, into his roster of informal collectors of intelligence. It's hard to believe that FDR was not at least familiar with this name, for they had been classmates at Columbia Law School, although doubtless had moved in very different social circles. Yet Donovan was also widely known in his own right as a true American war hero, having won not only the Congressional Medal of Honor for his service with the New York Fighting Irish 69th Regiment in France, but also the Distinguished Service Cross, the Distinguished Service Medal, and 3 Purple Hearts as well. In addition to rising to lead the regiment in its triumphal march down Fifth Avenue, Donovan had become a highly successful lawyer and had risen quickly in Republican politics in New York State. Now, I would pause here for a moment, and if we recognize the contribution that Donovan made with all the medals, there was another hero of the same vintage who did not receive the medals and the recognition because his victory was a victory in a different kind of war, a Cold War, if you will, but no less vicious and no less threatening to our freedoms. That other hero, certainly on an equal par with Bill Donovan, was Bill Casey. It was only logical, therefore, that prior to Pearl Harbor, FDR had sent Donovan on 2 long trips to Europe and the Balkans, receiving lengthy but very informative reports on the latter's return, particularly his conviction that Great Britain would not surrender, a finding which was in stark contrast to the reporting from London of U.S. Ambassador Joseph Kennedy. In addition to lengthy trip reports, Donovan urged FDR to establish some form of a centralized intelligence apparatus, not only to consolidate the growing flood of reporting from governmental agencies, but also to address the need to perform a host of paramilitary functions, which the U.S. government was simply not equipped to handle. And in addition to the importuning from Donovan and his coterie of informal roving ambassadors, Donovan's urgings were strongly supported by the UK, and especially by Winston Churchill, who could be very persuasive when he chose to do so. And the War Cabinet as well, which understood that the Second World War would be won only with American involvement, and the sooner the better. In the face of bitter domestic resistance, and remember FDR was facing an election, third-term election, bitter resistance, especially from the FBI, but also from the military, Roosevelt nonetheless accepted Donovan's forceful arguments and on 12 July 1941 issued an executive order establishing the Coordinator of Information with Donovan as its head. After Pearl Harbor, FDR went one step further and expanded the role of the Coordinator of Information into the Office of Strategic Services on 13 June 1942, again with General Donovan at its head. He'd been a colonel, but fortunately he became a brigadier and then ultimately a major general. Among the many elements of this new organization, which to some extent mirrored the British Special Operations Executive, that was the organization created by Churchill, as he said, to set Europe ablaze, and it did so. There were branches, the 2 key branches were Special Operations, SO, and Special Intelligence, or Secret Intelligence, SI. They were the largest ones, and then there was a third major element, which was research and analysis, the exploitation of the information produced by the other 2. Their respective roles were unconventional warfare, espionage, traditional espionage, if there is such a thing, it's a wonderful contradiction in terms, and evaluation and characterization, distribution of the finished intelligence. There was one other branch which I might mention in passing, a far smaller one in size. I hope that doesn't affect anyone, that the lights went down a bit, but it's most welcome. The other branch I was about to mention was labeled X2 from the British XB for counterintelligence and counterespionage, of which it was sometimes said that their work was so secret that not even those assigned to it were always sure what they were doing. I conclude this observation only in self-defense because my service was X2 throughout my time with the OSS. Unfortunately, I'd hoped that I would be accompanied as well today by my dear friend and also great hero of OSS, Major General Jack Singlaub. But Owen will do very well as, thank you. Jack was one of the great heroes of OSS and of the U.S. Army, really. In very brief words, he parachuted into France, first of all, and was instrumental in organizing the Maquisards, who impeded the arrival of German armored divisions to threaten the Normandy beachhead. And by their work, they delayed the arrival of those armored divisions until the beachhead was secure.
Jack would have been with us today, except yesterday his doctors grounded him and wouldn't let him fly. So he's doing well, he's down in Tennessee, but he just couldn't make it today.
And he called me to say he was missing the occasion and would love to be here, but his wife had put shackles around both his ankles, and he was unable to leave the house. Not only did he do that, but for an encore, he jumped into occupied China to a prisoner of war camp which held hundreds, literally hundreds of Allied prisoners. And by force of his persuasiveness, he convinced the Japanese commander, who was by far his senior officer, Jack adopted a couple of stars for the occasion, to surrender. And by so doing, he saved the lives of literally hundreds of Allied prisoners of war and took in a few Japanese generals to boot. I can't begin to repeat how well he does it, but at least he should be recognized on this occasion. The rest of OSS was not as important. The SO and SI were the major elements, and I stress that because Bill's service was in SI in London, and I'll get to that shortly. There were other elements, obviously, the usual administrative people, morale operations, a maritime unit, something called special projects, which nobody ever really figured out what it was doing, but it was a good name. The operational group was like SO, except that it involved using Americans of first-generation heritage who spoke the local language fluently to jump back into those countries, particularly the Balkans, and especially Greece and Albania, of all places, and organize large resistance groups in battalion and even regimental size, which harassed the Germans throughout the remainder of the war. Enter William Joseph Casey, who, following his brother George into the military service, was able to gain a commission as a lieutenant junior grade in the U.S. Navy, serving in the Office of Procurement and Materiel in Washington in June and July of 1943. This restless mind was quickly bored by the pedestrian world of naval procurement, however, and he cast about for a more active role. Fortuitously, a former law partner of his was already serving with OSS headquarters and was able to arrange for Bill to be interviewed by a mysterious Colonel Vanderblue, who has never been further identified, which in turn quickly led to Bill's being hired by Otto During, who was Donovan's right-hand man and law partner. During assigned Bill to a group of young lawyers running Donovan's secretariat in Washington as preparation for an assignment to London to organize a similar secretariat for what was described as a chaotic situation in the front office of the London station chief, Colonel David Bruce. Armed with a handwritten letter from General Donovan, Casey presented himself to Bruce in October of 1943. The latter opened the letter from Donovan and commented, "My, what a nice letter. I will certainly want to put this in my personal file right away. But I'm sure we'll find something useful for you to do here. Good day." and that was Bill Casey's introduction to the London station. Casey was by no means nonplussed by this airy dismissal and set about looking for a productive way to employ his boundless energies. But first he attended a meeting on OSS finances chaired by a Navy Captain, Junius Morgan. As the junior officer present, Bill stood by the door as the others entered until Lieutenant Commander Guest appeared, and in a peremptory tone turned to Casey and said, "Lieutenant, get me a chair." Whereupon Bill responded, "Get it yourself." Quickly followed by an audible gasp which went around the room. Shortly after the awkward meeting adjourned, Casey was summoned by Captain Morgan to his office. Obviously embarrassed, Morgan began by saying that Commander Guest was demanding a captain's mast to discipline this unsubordinate officer. Plaintively, it is recorded, Captain Morgan looked at Bill and said, quote, "Bill, will you please try to be a bit more cordial the next time you encounter Commander Guest?" and dismissed him. It is this presence of many members of high society in OSS's ranks, by the way, to include Vanderbilts, Morgans, Mellons, and such, that led to the moniker of "oh so social." That's among the more printable versions of OSS expansion. To Casey, however, they were the white shoe boys, as he loved to label them, for whom he did not display the expected obedience and deference. Bill's search for a useful way to engage his formidable talent and relentless curiosity led him to uncover the fact that there was a veritable tsunami of reporting from many sources flowing into the London station, especially from the governments in exile from France, Belgium, Norway, and other places. And at the time, there was no orderly way of recording, processing, and disseminating the material, a task which he jumped into with great relish. One of his colleagues, incidentally, it is recorded, observed that Bill could take vast amounts of paper and reduce them to coherent, eminently readable, and interesting digests. The only problem, this wag subsequently observed, was that even though 50% of it was pure horse manure, it was so beautifully done that even Bill himself came to believe in it. One of the things Bill also learned shortly after his arrival in London was that not all Englishmen welcomed the rising tide of American officials, even in the intelligence realm. A senior official in MI6, Malcolm Muggeridge, commented, and I quote, "Ah, those first OSS arrivals in London. How well I remember them, arriving like jeune fille en fleur, straight from finishing school, all fresh and innocent, to start work in our frowsy old intelligence brothel," unquote. And the Russian agent of long standing, Kim Philby, characterized the Americans as, quote, "a notably bewildered group," unquote, whose arrival in London was, quote, "a pain in the neck," unquote. And one of the other favorite expansions that the British used was to describe the American invasion of their homeland, as it were, was over here, overpaid, and oversexed. But the real recognition and exploitation of Bill's talents occurred when Donovan came to see them in action and made Bill his man in London. What that meant in practical terms was that he turned to Bill for much of his information about activities in London, and whenever he came, Bill was constantly at his beck and call. One of Bill's favorite stories about Donovan's visit when he occupied a large suite at Claridge's was that the last thing at night, he would send Bill to Bumpus's bookstore around the corner with instructions to pick up any new books on history, military affairs, and economics. Bill would return with an armload of books and depart for the night. The next morning, as Donovan was preparing himself for his day and Bill was waiting for him, Bill would quickly take a peek at the pile of books and discover to his amazement that they were full of marginalia, indicating that Donovan had gone through them all during the night. It was a habit Bill acquired, by the way, when he was director of the DCI. Every city he visited, the first thing he had his security people identify was the bookstores. And he never failed to come back with a fair portion of that library and also peruse them and added lots of marginalia of his own. Both men early on recognized how much they had in common: insatiable thirst for knowledge, a willingness to consider new and different ideas, and an endless curiosity about all things in minds which seemed never to tire and were impatient with lesser mortals who could not follow the turns and twists of their fertile imaginations. As a consequence, Donovan increasingly took Bill with him on some of his most hazardous trips, including a visit to Normandy on D-Day +2, where both men were appalled by the destruction and wreckage littering the beaches. It will surprise no one that Bill Casey had begun sending his own thoughts and ideas to Donovan regularly by cable, and they exchanged thoughts regularly. So it must have struck a sympathetic chord when he noted in a message dated shortly after the liberation of Paris that it was time to start thinking about and planning for the next major challenge to confront OSS in Europe, the penetration of Germany to provide that kind of tactical and strategic intelligence so necessary to winning the war once the liberation of France was complete. His message struck a chord with Donovan, not surprisingly, who urged him to begin drafting concrete proposals for fulfilling this vital task. It came as no surprise, therefore, that when the incumbent OSS Chief of Secret Intelligence in London departed, the powers that be wasted no time in selecting Bill Casey for this daunting challenge, and it is ironic that until the date of his selection, his official title had remained Chief of a non-existent secretariat. Recognizing that Bill's modest rank would be something of a hindrance in his dealings he would now be having with very senior Allied officers, David Bruce took him to see Admiral Stark, the U.S. naval commander in Europe, in hopes of arranging a few extra stripes to a more suitable rank. The good admiral politely declined the prospect of offending a wide range of more senior naval officers, but offered an alternative. He took Bill and David Bruce out of the office and around to a clothing store where he produced coupons to purchase 2 civilian gray suits for Bill Casey, at which time Bill entered a curious twilight zone of, quote, inactive Navy service, unquote, and placed his uniform in mothballs. Bill attacked this new assignment with his usual energy and imagination. He quickly realized that 2 major problems consulted him. The first was where to find potential agents for infiltration through German lines into the heartland, and second, how to communicate with agents inside Germany once they became established there. Unlike France, Belgium, and other countries, they could hardly wander the streets with a suitcase full of radio equipment. With his usual drive and imagination, he first decided to visit his UK counterparts, the head of MI6 and the head of SOE, both of whom were very negative, discouraging, and said that this simply could not be done, that they had tried and failed. Bill came back to the office delighted. He said, "Great, that means I won't have to get them out of my way when I do my job." First of all, he found a former RCA employee hidden somewhere in the bowels of the OSS station, and he sat down with him and he said, "Here's my problem, what do I do about it?" And after not too long a time, the RCA man came back to him and said, "I've solved your problem for you, Bill." He said, "Great, what am I going to do?" And he said, "I've developed something called a Joan Eleanor. And the Joan Eleanor consists of a very small transceiver that'll fit in the palm of your hand. That emits a signal which goes vertically up into the stratosphere, but at ground level, it has no dispersion whatsoever. The size of the signal is less than the thickness of a pencil, and it will go directly up, and as it does, it spreads so that if there's an airplane circulating the right time up there in the sky, it can pick up that signal, record it, and have a two-way conversation with the sender on the ground with a small handheld transceiver." That was one solution, and it worked like a charm, was used extensively with agents who did get inside Germany. His second problem, of course, was finding people to get through into Germany successfully. This was unlike the occupied countries of France and Belgium and the Netherlands, where it was a sympathetic reception committee, and finding help on the ground was relatively simple. In Germany, there would be no friendly faces whatsoever. In fact, anything but. Putting on his thinking cap, Bill solved this problem on the ground, starting with refugees he identified in London from Germany and Austria. He had a labor branch in the London station, which dealt regularly with refugees from that part of the world, and they were able to find some Germans and Austrians prepared to go back in under very deepest of covers. He also sent some of his OSS people in German uniforms into POW cages, and they would rattle around and talk to the prisoners there. And although it's against the Articles of War to force prisoners of war to work against their native country, by talking to enough people, they found discontented prisoners who were prepared to put back on their German uniforms and go back into Germany and Austria to serve as spies for OSS. The success of Bill's efforts in this program are reflected by the fact that his efforts were responsible for the dispatch of 150 agents into Germany, including as far as Berlin and Vienna, 95% of whom survived to tell their tales, a remarkable performance. One of his most successful operations was recruiting an Austrian socialist woman known as Crocus, who was infiltrated back into Vienna through Switzerland and produced and organized an extensive and productive network of Austrian socialists opposed to Hitler. Upon return from her briefing in Switzerland, she unfortunately stumbled across an SS patrol, and although gravely wounded in both legs, attempted to escape from the patrol, but was so wounded that she could not, at which point she bit into her L tablet and committed suicide. As the war in Europe was nearing its end, Bill was urged to sign on to become chief of SI for all of Germany. He said, "I really am not interested in Germany as such, and I have no command of the German language, but I'm prepared to pack up my people and go to the Far East and repeat the performance on Japan." When the war in Europe then ended, Bill returned to his wife and daughter in the US, which is what he really wanted to do anyway, in expectation, nonetheless, of possible deployment to the Far East. But nuclear weapons were dropped, excuse me, and in August 1945, Japan surrendered, the war was over, and Bill immediately submitted his resignation. His personnel file contains a long and plaintive letter from David Bruce's successor in London, General Donovan, begging the general to prevail upon Bill to stay on, a letter which is indeed a tribute to Bill's hugely successful tour of duty in London. He had also been recognized, by the way, by the Bronze Star awarded to him by Admiral Stark, and his file contains a glowing recommendation of several pages in length, so highly classified that it obviously never went anywhere, for the Legion of Merit, and that seems to have been lost in the shuffle of demobilization somewhere because it was never acted upon, unfortunately. And true to General Donovan's bleak comment at the time of Roosevelt's death, "We have lost the one man who kept the wolves from the door." It took President Truman less than 2 months to issue an executive order abolishing OSS and scattering the remnants to the four winds, dismissing General Donovan with the faintest of praise. The ultimate irony, of course, is that it required less than 2 years for Truman to recognize the indispensability of a central intelligence agency, which was reconstituted by the National Security Act of 1947. Bill was asked some years later to sum up his view of these frenetic years, and I quote his response: "Maybe it was because I was young, but I'd never known such responsibility. I had 500 people under me, a couple of air squadrons at my disposal, a dozen French chateaux where we kept agents. I could walk into Patton's or Bradley's briefings anytime I wanted to. I felt part of something larger than myself. I was making decisions that were a part of history. It was the greatest experience of my life, end quote. And what was the official OSS view of Casey's service? Again, I quote, "It has been the policy of the OSS never to hesitate to assign major responsibility to younger men who have what it takes. This policy has been, in my opinion, one of our primary sources of strength. It has been vindicated by the outstanding performance of many, but none by more than your own. You took up one of the heaviest loads which any of us had to carry at a time when the going was roughest, and you delivered brilliantly, forcefully, and in good time." Signed, William J. Donovan, Major General, U.S. Army.
Mr. Ambassador, I want to say thank you. I am quite familiar. I am quite familiar with the literature of the OSS, as you can well imagine, and obviously with the literature of Bill Casey's life. But enough of that talk has never been published before that I'm going to urge both the IWP Press and the OSS Society to publish it in their newsletters and their publications. Our next part of Bill Casey's public life, as you know, he went into private life, practiced law in New York, and I got to know him then. He was a publisher, did a lot of writing, and I was part of that life. But we're looking here at his public life. And the next phase of his public life was he was asked by President Nixon to become chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission. And at that position, he met a fellow who became known as the enforcer of Wall Street. The tough cop on Wall Street is the expression that was used. When Bill left public life and then went back in 1980 as Director of Central Intelligence, he asked that tough cop to go with him as General Counsel of the CIA. Of course, I'm talking about Judge Stanley Sporkin. Subsequently, he became a district court judge, and now he's, some people say he's retired. I don't think he's retired. He's still very active. He's no longer on the bench. He's coming up here right now, and I don't see any black robes on him, so I guess he's not going to play that role. But Judge Stanley Sporkin is going to talk about Bill's role at the SEC and also, I think, relates to his role at the agency, too. The agency that doesn't exist. I was just out in San Diego, and somebody told me, oh, there is no such agency. But I was with the people who build the drones. Okay, thank you. Judge? You want to sit down?
Yeah, no, I'll be all right. Okay. God, what a pleasure this is. After hearing that wonderful talk, and to sort of fit it in with my background with him. I'm so pleased and proud to be here to celebrate Bill's 100th birthday. He was, as Bernadette said, a wonderful human being. In my estimation, there was really nobody like him. First, he was the smartest individual I have ever known. He had a photographic memory. He was a voracious reader. And as was pointed out, after reading 2 to 3 books an evening, he would, and after doing all his other work, he would still find time to do that. When I used to travel with him, we would go to play. One time I was with him in Canada, and he, first thing he did was go to the bookstore, pick up all the books, We were in Quebec City, and he wanted to fight the battle of the Plains of Abraham, and we had to go to the local diorama and see whether he was right in where how the battle was won. But I got to know Bill when President Nixon appointed him the chairman. Among the career staff at the SEC, there was always a great deal of anxiety when a new chairman came aboard. The staff fears were in no way diminished when Bill moved in with his kitchen cabinet, a dozen or so very bright and eager assistants, including Ted Rowe, who is here today. Those folks took over every phase of the commission. This was the way, now we know why Bill was, how he used to fight wars. He just took over the whole commission. But he soon learned that he might have made a miscalculation in underestimating the capability of the career staff. He was a fast learner and quite facile. He saw there were members of the staff who were willing to carry out his plans and to work with him. And he was looking for people. You had to understand that he was a person that was a tremendous decision maker. And he always looked for people. I didn't realize that I was one of those folks that could do it, but he saw something in me. And therefore, he and I got along together. But there's one incident that Bill found quite amusing at the SEC. We had sued Sharon Steele for misusing employees' pension funds. After settling the case, Bill called me one afternoon to report the following incident. He said that he was just visited in his office by I.W. Abel, the much feared president of the Steelworkers Union, who Bill said, asked him what kind of Republican trick was he pulling off to win over the hearts and minds of the steelworkers. He couldn't believe that the Republicans would do something like that. After sharing with me Abel's remarks, Bill confessed that he and Abel were good friends and that Abel was truly appreciative of the work that Bill had done in protecting those steelworkers. Even though Bill was only at the SEC a short time, he made remarkable changes. One of the important steps he took was enlisting the aid of the well-known New York attorney Jack Wells to look at certain of the SEC's enforcement practices. Out of this study came the so-called Wells Letter, which requires the SEC staff to advise persons under investigation that the staff was about to recommend proceedings against them and to provide them with an opportunity to respond so that the commission would have their views when they took action. Over the years, this procedure, any in the audience know about this procedure in the practice of in their legal practices? I don't see too many hands, but that is really a very important change that was made and now has been picked up by other agencies, and it's become a fairly famous thing. We should call it the Casey rather than the Wells Letter, but it came out of Bill Casey's work. The trepidation I had from my first meeting with Bill had fully disappeared during our time at the SEC. I greatly missed him when he left the commission to become Undersecretary of State for Economic Affairs and later chairman of the Export-Import Bank. He asked me to join him at the bank, but I decided it was not the right time for me to leave the SEC. Looking back, I believe that Bill was hurt by that, and because we had really bonded, and now when you look back, you sometimes are sorry that certain moves you didn't make. I heard nothing from Bill for a number of years. When Henry Kissinger became Secretary of State, Bill left his post at State to lead the Export-Import Bank. Can you imagine those sessions at the State Department between Henry and Bill, how Henry, you couldn't understand him, and Bill sometimes had a language of his own. And how they would communicate would be very difficult, so I guess that's why Bill had to leave and go somewhere else. And he left the government when the Carter administration came in. I thought of Bill a great deal during that time. I followed his career from the press reports, and I was pleasantly surprised when the former governor of California appointed Bill to lead his presidential campaign after the governor had lost the Iowa primary. I later learned that the defeat was not only a negative result that came out of that loss. The campaign had serious financial problems. So Bill, as he started to lead the campaign, was faced with some very serious challenges. When Reagan was elected, Bill was extremely proud of his contributions, both at the primary and the general election stages. And during this entire period, I heard little from Bill until one day I received a curt message that he wanted to see me at his temporary residence at the Jefferson Hotel. I met with Bill and Sophia in his suite. We had drinks, and in Bill's typical direct manner said, "Stan, even though you turned me down at the XM job, I'm going to ask you one more time to work with me. I want you to be general counsel of the CIA." He told me to take my time and to talk it over with my wife and to get back to him as soon as possible. Knowing how decisive Bill was, I hesitated for only a moment, and I said, "You got your man." I just wanted so badly to work with him again, so I had to accept the consequences if there were any. Even Bill was surprised by my quick decision. We had some further small talk and I left. He had told me during that discussion that the reason he had not talked to me for so long was that he didn't want me to get involved into politics, and because he knew I was a civil servant, and show you that's how ethical Bill was. That evening at home, I convened a small family gathering to tell them about my meeting with Bill and his offer. I was afraid to tell them that I had already accepted it until I had received their approval. My wife Judy is here today, liked the idea since she was a big fan of spy novels. My son Dan, who is also here today, simply said, "You are certainly going to change the image of what a spy is supposed to look like." For several months, I heard nothing further about the offer and was quite perplexed. I didn't know whether Bill had forgotten about me, and so I just bided my time at the SEC to bring my 20-year tenure there to a close. What happened next will show you Bill's OSS skills. Several months after my meeting with Bill, I was attending a funeral service for a prominent DC lawyer who was also Bill's friend. I was there with another SEC staff member, and as we were leaving the church and walking to my colleague's car, I was tapped on the shoulder by someone who said, "The boss wants to see you." Bill had also been attending the funeral and was getting in his car at the time. My friend was startled when he saw me going with this individual who took me to Bill's car. When I saw Bill, he told me to get in the car. I told my friend that everything was all right and that I was not being kidnapped. And I explained to him later. We drove to the CIA headquarters at Langley, at which point, with few words, Bill turned me over, that's the way he used to operate, to the head of CIA personnel, with Harry Fitzwater, with a crisp message to get me processed as soon as possible. In Harry Fitzwater's office, I kid you not, he asked me what job had Bill promised me. I could have run the agency. So after a background check, a psychiatric examination, and a polygraph test, I didn't know all this was going to happen. I was ushered in at the CIA's as CIA's fifth general counsel. I was a fish out of water. I knew nothing about spying. Indeed, one of the questions a psychiatrist asked me was, why did I want to work for the CIA? When I answered, I had no interest in working for the CIA, and that I only wanted to be with my old friend Bill Casey. I thought I had flunked the exam. As my tenure as general counsel began, it was not well received by my office. In effect, I was an outsider, and they kept me in isolation. I was told nothing, and nobody came to see me. Bill was too busy to spend time with me because he was doing a lot of other things. I soon realized it was up to me to learn on the job. Then one day, shortly after arriving at the CIA, I learned there was a God. One evening while I was at home, I got a call from someone who said his name was Max. My wife could see it was an unusual call, as she could only hear my part of the conversation. This fellow who called himself Max said he needed to see me right away. He said it was urgent. I asked him where we should meet. He said at his place. I asked where was his place, and he said it was near the place. It became clear to me that I was onto something, and that this was the way the spy business operated. I agreed to meet him at his place. As I was preparing to go, my wife said, "Don't go, it's a setup." She reminded me of the many spy novels that she had read and how naive I was since I knew nothing about spy operations. In those days, you could get by with not listening to your spouse and merely asking for forgiveness later. So off I went to meet this fellow named Max, whom I had not met before. At the meeting, I learned that Max was Max Hugel, who Bill had recently appointed to head the clandestine service. He was brought in from the outside world who, like me, had no prior spy experience. Max was extremely successful in business, and Bill thought he could be very helpful in running the clandestine service. Max told me his problem. He had been with Bill in Central America, getting ready to attend a meeting with the Contras, when Bill received word that Bob Woodward of the Washington Post was working on a story about Max and his stock dealings while he was in the private sector. Max said that Bill told him to immediately return to headquarters and contact me. Although I was not happy about Max's predicament, I said, "Wow, my first big case at the CIA was a securities case. Thank God." How did someone ever get that lucky? After being briefed by Max, I realized I had something I could sink my teeth into. Because Bill was in Central America, I was on my own. I called Woodward, whom I had known from my SEC days. He said he would fill me in, but only if I would bring Max to the Washington Post's offices. Since I did not represent Max, with his permission, I arranged for him to be represented by counsel. We went to the Post offices, and although not planned, we shortly found ourselves in a deposition-like setting with the Post reporters and a Post lawyer asking questions of Max, and my being able to get the information that I needed. After several hours of this Q&A, Ben Bradley, the Post executive editor-in-chief, barged into the room asking who turned the Washington Post into a court of law. He looked at me and said, "Sporkin, only someone like you could do this." He said the party was over, and he called the meeting to an end. On the way back to Langley, I realized that Max could not be saved and that he would have to resign. I drafted the resignation papers, and Brief and I had a big discussion, and after the discussion, he fully agreed with my assessment. Bill and I told Max that it was in his interest because if he stayed on, he would be, subjected to congressional hearings and possible investigation by the Department of Justice, and that if he left, that thing would go away in a short period of time. It did act, the strategy worked. The unfortunate part that Max held it against Bill and me for doing what we did. The Hugel affair caused Bill a new set of problems. The people who didn't like him were not happy with Bill's decision to bring in someone from the outside to run the crown jewel department of the CIA. A campaign was mounted to undercut Bill. Information started to emerge about Bill's stock dealings. One Saturday morning, Bill came to my office at Langley to tell me that at noon there was going to be a press conference and they wanted me to be there and address the press. Because it was Saturday morning, I was wearing casual clothes. I had no coat or tie. I was on my way home to get it when Bill said, no, no, you have no time, and I would have to wear his jacket and tie. Now, everybody knew Bill's ties. He used to chew them. So I had to deal with that. But Bill was what, 6'4"? How tall was Bill? 6'2". 6'2". I'm 5'9". Okay. Can you imagine the way I look wearing his jacket with the sleeves coming down to my knees and, and having to go before the press? But in any event, Bill's strategy worked. We were able to quiet the press by telling them there was no securities case against Bill. Here, once again, I was at the CIA dealing in a securities matter and not a national security matter. I had often thought that Bill selected me because he knew something that I didn't know, that they're going to have more securities problems than national security problem. He still had one big hurdle to overcome. The committee, the Intelligence Committee was pressing Bill to put his stock holdings in a blind trust. The issue continued to come up time and time again. In my view, it could only be resolved by Bill placing his holdings in the blind trust. I prepared the papers and presented them to Bill for his signature. He resisted. He asked me whether he was legally required to do so. I said no, he was not legally required to do so. And I told him it was the only way we were going to silence his critics. It was the only time between Bill and I that we ever had any kind of a disagreement. Finally, I said to Bill that he had two choices: either put his holdings in a blind trust or accept my resignation. In typical Casey fashion, he took my pen and signed the trust paper saying, "Now you can leave." This ended the early skirmishes and allowed Bill to take charge of the agency and to do his magic. Our nation was faced with many difficult challenges. Bill had been working on the so-called Reagan Doctrine, which was to thwart communism in its tracks, which at that time was creeping up and taking over Central America. It was very close to home. Bill was convinced that up to that point in history, there had never been a reversal of communism once it had taken its foothold in a country. Thus, we were facing very serious threats in our own hemisphere. The administration wanted to turn back communism in Nicaragua, where it had taken a foothold. The CIA was working with the Contras. The Congress was willing to provide funds so long as the money was not being used to overthrow the Nicaraguan government. One of the goals for the legal department was to take it from a strictly, one of my goals was to take it from a strictly reactive group and turn it into a counseling group in part. I wanted to start advising the agency affirmatively about how to stay out of trouble. The so-called Bolin Amendment gave me that opportunity. It provided that no CIA funds could be spent for the purposes of overthrowing the Nicaraguan government. Accordingly, I had the staff prepare a paper that would counsel how the agency should proceed to keep it in line with the Bolin Amendment. The staff was somewhat comprehensive. It did not think it would go well with either Bill or the clandestine operators. I presented the paper to Bill, who in his own inimical way took the document and began to mark it up to make it a much more readable and more effective document. More important, when he had finished his editing, the document was in plain English and not legalese. If you know, Bill not only was a tremendous lawyer and brilliant and everything, but he was a tremendous writer. And he was just marvelous with words, and we had a very effective document, and he appreciated that. He thought that was a great idea, what we were doing. The day-to-day challenges involve things that I would never have imagined. Take, for example, where the CIA sued ABC Network at the FCC for violating the fairness doctrine in a particular case. Can you imagine him? One day we're talking, he said, well, what are we going to be able to do with this guy? The ABC came out with this crazy story which was false, and they would do nothing about it. And so we decided that we said, well, let's sue him. He said, well, how can the SEC sue somebody? I don't know. He said, sue him. So we figured out we'll sue him before the FCC because they weren't adhering to the fairness doctrine, which was to show a balanced approach, and it worked. We had a wonderful complaint, and other papers picked it up, and it brought great, they took it out on ABC. They criticized it tremendously for what they were doing. We were compatible. We were able to communicate. I don't know, many of you work with him, but when you get in sync with Bill, you can communicate without communicating with him. You just know it. He knows what to be doing. That's the way it would be done. At times, the operators only wanted, when they presented you with an idea, all they wanted to know whether it was legal or not, and I was never going to buy into that concept, and Bill wasn't. And Bill said, no, I want your view as to whether it makes sense or not. And that's the way we used to deal with that, not on a strictly legal basis. If it was a bad idea, it was a bad idea. Now, and he always backed me up. There also came times when the staff believed Bill needed to receive a message on certain matters, which they did not believe they could give to him, and so they would come to me and say, you give him the bad news. And so that became part of my job. And I must emphasize that both at the SEC and the CIA, when Bill left those places, the respective staffs were extremely sorry to see him leave. He provided not only a tremendous management and ability in doing things, but it was an excitement. Can you imagine in bureaucratic Washington that somebody can be an exciting leader? And he did that. He just got everything working. The Iran-Contra affair was something I have not really touched on. We at the agency did what we had to do, I believe, by getting the president to make a finding. In my view, this protected all those involved in the operation, except for those that really didn't tell the whole story. If they had told the whole story, there would have been no problems because the president had bailed them out. When time came for me to leave the agency, Bill recommended me to the president to be a judge. For that, I will always be grateful. My nomination was not an easy one. One positive thing that it did do was to bring about a degree of bipartisanship. This I learned when Bill remarked to me one day that he received a call from Senator Ted Kennedy, who wanted to work with Bill to support my nomination. Can you imagine Bill and Ted, what a combination that was, but, and he liked it. He liked working with him. There was nothing better than working with Bill. To repeat, he was the smartest, the most decent man that I ever met. I had the good fortune to work with him not only once, but twice. He taught me a great deal, particularly about decision-making. He believed that making a decision is extremely important because not making a decision is, in effect, making a decision that might not always be the right one. And I think, Owen, you'll agree with me, that was one of his greatest views and legacies. And, of course, Bill, I want to obviously thank you for all that you did for me and my family. And, of course, want to wish you a happy 100th birthday. And I want to thank Bernadette and Owen for this wonderful event, which it just is terrific. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Judge. That was excellent. We really appreciate it. My understanding from we're a little bit off our schedule, but that's not unusual for an event like this. But my understanding is that it's now time that we get something to eat. Now, a few administrative details. There is no restrooms on this floor. They're downstairs one floor. There's an elevator, and some people may want to use that. We'll be having a buffet luncheon here, and in a little while after, what?
Can we have a few minutes for Tom to say a few words?
Okay. 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 By the state. Okay, great. Okay. We're going to delay, tell the caterer we're going to delay a few minutes.
5 minutes.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Owen.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Tom Dawson. I met Bill Casey in December of 1972, when I was a 24-year-old Foreign Service officer and he was a 59-year-old about to become Undersecretary of State. Someone had to take the briefing books over to the SEC. And it was 5:30 in the afternoon, and none of the other career Foreign Service officers wanted to do it. So I took the briefing books over. He asked me lots of questions, which I got accustomed to later. And that's the last I saw of him for a couple of months, at which point he had gone through 3 special assistants selected by the Secretariat, which was that part of the State Department. It's affectionately or formally known as SS. And I got the job. I had a wonderful year and a half. And frankly, much of the rest of my life has been a result of that initial association. He claimed that he introduced my wife and myself at a church in Rio de Janeiro on a State Department trip. What actually happened was my wife was, my then almost desired but not yet girlfriend, was going to Mass on a Sunday morning. He saw her coming out of the hotel when we were, and I was going with him since I spoke Portuguese, and he invited her to join us. So a little bit of truth. The book stories are fantastic. I knew them all. The library is missing the books that he left on airplanes because I was there. I tried to pick them up. I couldn't. I bumped into him one Saturday morning at an old bookstore on DuPont Circle, which many of you will remember. I literally backed into him. He was collecting hardbacks. I was collecting paperbacks. We went to London, and he would go to the bookstore that I think was alluded to earlier quite regularly on his trips. He had a charge account at the bookstore, even though the ladies at the front desk said there were no people with charge accounts. They checked in the back. In fact, he had a charge account at this bookstore. He, on one of his visits there, I think it was his second visit there was sort of some turmoil outside, and the British police had arrived because they thought the bookstore was about to be robbed. Because Casey was in there, I was there, and his 2 State Department security guys were in there, and it looked like they were casing the joint, which is exactly what happened. Bernadette may remember the story of one weekend, Mr. Casey, because I never called him Bill. Mr. Casey took one of my briefcases home full of papers up to New York from DC, and my briefcase never returned. Mrs. Casey later confessed that this was her story, whether true or not, was that he'd been in a hurry to go to Mass, had left the briefcase behind the car, and had accidentally backed over it. I got a replacement suitable. In Sochi, on a trip, he went swimming in the Black Sea with both his KGB and his State Department security guys. They were, I think, mostly keeping an eye on each other. In Moscow, he managed to go out to dinner at a restaurant after the KGB people had told him there are no restaurants in Moscow. This is the famous one, which many of you may know of. It's a Georgian restaurant. He went to the restaurant without a reservation, finally having convinced the KGB he could go there, and the KGB, shall we say, assisted in clearing a table for him. In Paris, one time he had an official dinner at a restaurant on Ile-Saint-Louis. I can't remember the name of it, but it was a very fancy restaurant. The next morning, he called me to his room at the Creole, very sheepish, that he had gone to the restaurant taking out some senior officials and hadn't brought a credit card. So I was sent back to pay for the dinner at this restaurant in Ile-Saint-Louis, which I did. There was a reference made to how Casey and Kissinger got along. Not well. I have to say I have a bit of a conflict since my wife wound up working in Kissinger's private office after he left for a while, but the personality issues are the same. The Casey staff, the Kissinger staff managed to change the locks on the private elevators so that Casey could not go up and down from where his car dropped him off, would have to go in through the communal elevators. I tried my best, could not get his staff to reverse it. It never was clear whether Kissinger was behind it. I certainly thought his staff would support him. But when Casey finally was in seeing Kissinger about something, Kissinger picks up the phone and growls to his secretary, "Get this man a key." So for at least the remainder of the time, he was in fact able to get the key. I went to Brazil as my next assignment. Casey went to XM, and I was applying to business school. I don't think Barbara was working at Rogers and Wells at the time, but I asked him to do a letter of recommendation. And from Brazil in those days, it's not too easy to communicate. I never heard anything back, not ever, and initially did not. After several weeks, I called up at some expense to Rogers and Wells, and the secretary on the phone says, "Well, Mr. Dawson, he's sometimes a little slow in answering, but I'll get to work on it." Turned out he got the letter done. and I left the Foreign Service, went off to business school. I called him in the summer of what would have been 76, to thank him for the application, and he gets on the phone immediately without my having said what I was calling about. He says, "Tom, I'm sorry I was late with that letter of recommendation, but I never understood why you wanted to go to business school. I always considered you fully educated." Which I thought was a wonderful phrase. I didn't have the self-confidence that he did. In the the winter of 1980, I had the similar experience hearing about Casey taking over the campaign. I almost drove straight through Ward Circle the night that I heard about that. And in the summer of '80, I was working for McKinsey & Company, who were approached by the Reagan campaign. I'm not sure whether Ed was in this meeting or not. Helene Van Damme, I know, was there, and Penn James was there. McKinsey was asked to provide some advice planning personnel. And the McKinsey people quickly decided that it was too political for a consulting firm like that. They said, but our campaign chairman, Bill Casey, would like to come in and thank you anyway. So he comes in, and he's being introduced to some people from the campaign as well as from McKinsey, and he comes up and he sees me, and they're about to introduce him to me. And he says, why, hi, Tom. And he turns to the group and he says, you said McKinsey wouldn't do this. Tom just agreed to take a leave without pay and do it for free. Which is exactly what happened. I had relatively intermittent contact with him during the administration, but I did, it was partly because of all of this. Everything goes back to Bill Casey in my career. But because of all of this, I wound up working for Ronald Reagan, another controversial Irishman. His 100th isn't up yet, but we'll get to work on that. I was riding with Reagan when he was at Treasury up to the Hill for some testimony, and Casey was in trouble for mining of the harbors in Nicaragua. And we listened to the story, and Reagan was just kind of smiling. And I said, you know, boss, I worked for Mr. Casey the only time he never got in trouble. And without missing a beat, Reagan said to me, you worked for him the only time he never got anything done. Which I think is quite a comment. My last conversation with Bill Casey, I worked in the White House with Ronald Reagan, and my secure phone rang. I think it was the only time my secure phone had ever rung the entire time I was in the White House. It was often used by people leaving the Oval Office to make calls. They would throw me out of my office. But it was Bill Casey calling, and I don't remember the individual, but it was a deceased station chief for whom I think may have been, you guys, some of you will know, I think he had gone to Notre Dame, and they were trying to do a letter from the president to Notre Dame that would reference him without referencing the agency that doesn't exist. And he'd had some trouble, not surprisingly, getting into the NSC staff, so he called me. The only time in the whole time of the Reagan administration he asked me to do something. And I, of course, happily got it done and sent on. But I kind of noticed, I said, now, why was he calling me? Well, this was shortly before both he fell ill, as well as Reagan getting politically ill and leaving office. In my, afterwards, when leaving the government, I was with Ronald Reagan and his post-government employee, and I believe that was at the time, I'm sure this was the book, it was the Walking Tour of the Revolution book. Yes. And it was published after he died. And is that right? I think it came.
The one that was published after he died was the one, the OSS.
Okay, the OSS one, okay. And I read a book review on a Sunday in the New York Times magazine, and or book review section. And so I go in Monday morning to Don Regan, and I say, hey, did you see that Bill Casey just published a book? And Regan gets this shocked look on his face. You mean Woodward's right? He didn't die? But in any event, I will absolutely say that Bill Casey lives on with me almost on a daily basis. I think about it all the time. I only see Bernadette every 10 or 15 years, but this was a fantastic event. I'm sorry I can't stay for the luncheon, but I really appreciated these stories. Stan Sporkin's story I particularly enjoyed because I remember him coming over to see Casey when I was the young guy at the State Department. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
you. It's amazing. I hear all these references to Henry Kissinger. I probably knew him before any of you did. I had him as a professor at Trinity College. He was an adjunct. He was up at Harvard, and he came down one day a week to teach us nuclear policy. He had just published a book on that, his first book. So that was in 1950. 57 to 58. So again, the logistics, there's going to be a buffet luncheon. It's open seating right outside. Most of you came in through the ballroom, which is where it's going to be. And the other logistical, well, we're going to have Ed, Mr. Attorney General, or Ed, is going to speak at about 1:30, and then we're going to reconvene here at 2, and around 2 or whenever he's finished. And the necessary rooms are one floor down. There's elevators for anybody who wants to use them. Okay, thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you at lunch.